So today we're going to be making a CRUD app with Ruby on Rails and React. And the app that we're going to be making is an airline reviews app. As you can see in front of me, we have this basic example of the app that we're going to be making. So if we look here, we can see we have this list of different airlines, and each one has this star rating score, which is based off reviews that belong to each airline. So if we jump into, for example, United Airlines here, we can see we go to a dedicated page for that airline, and we have this list of reviews on the left, as well as an overall average score and the ability to add a new review here on the right. So if we jump back, we can see, for example, over here we have an airline that doesn't have any reviews, so we can actually take a look at this. Let's say I add a new review here, so let's say we add a good review. I'm just going to give it a title of great time. We'll say, really enjoyed this flight. And we'll give that 5 stars. So we add our review. And so basically you can see that in real time that review is getting added over on the left, as well as an overall average score for that airline. So we can come back over here and give it a bad review. So let's say terrible experience. We can say I didn't like the snacks, let's say, and we'll give that 1 star. And let's add that review as well. And I can see we've added that review over on the left as well. And that's actually adjusted the overall average score for that airline. Now if we jump back over to the main index view, you can see the updated average score for the airline there. So that's the basic idea. It's just a simple CRUD app. It's going to have airlines and reviews. So we're going to be using Ruby on Rails. We're going to use React. We're going to use webpacker and some other interesting technologies as well. So let's get started. So first things first, let's go ahead and create a brand new Rails app. So we can do this with the command line by doing Rails new and then app name, where app name is the name of the app that you want to create. So in my case, I'm going to just call this Open Flights. And then we're going to add a couple of additional things here. So what I want to add is I want to do --webpack equals React. And that'll set us up by default to use webpacker and set it up with React. And then we can also add --database equals PostgreSQL. And that'll just set us up so that our default database for the app is going to be PostgreSQL. And then you can add anything else you want. For example, you could do -t to remove the default testing if you want to add something like RSpec. But this is what our basic command is going to look like to create our new Rails app. So I'm going to go ahead and just hit enter and run that. So now once that finishes running, let's go ahead and cd into the new app that we just created. So then let's go ahead and create our new database. So we can do Rails db create. And then let's go ahead and just open this up in a code editor. So I'm going to open this in VS Code. And I'm going to start by building out everything we need on the Rails side first, and then after that we can move into the React side of things. But the first thing that I want to do is I want to set up the models that we need for our app. So the initial models for our app are going to be pretty simple. We're going to have airlines, and then our airlines are going to have many reviews. So what we want to do is create an airline model and a review model initially. So for our airline model, when I think about the attributes that I want to add for that, we want to have a name for each airline. We also are probably going to want to have like an image URL that we can use for each airline's logo. And then I also want to add a unique slug that we can use as an identifier for each airline. And then for our review model, I want to have a title or a headline for each review. We also want a description or a body. And then I also want to add a score. And the scoring system that I'm going to use is going to be a star rating system that ranges from 1 to 5, where 1 is going to be the worst and 5 is going to be the best. And then we also want to add an airline ID for the parent airline that each review belongs to. So what we can do is jump back into our command line, and we can just use a Rails generator to create our new models. So we can do Rails gModel to use a generator to create a new model. And what I want to do is first I want to create my airline model. So we'll do Rails gModel airline. And then I want to go ahead and create all of the attributes here that I want to add to this model. So we want to create a name for each airline, and that's going to be a string. We also want to create an image URL for each airline, which is also going to be a string. And then for each airline, I want to create a unique slug, which is also going to be a string. So we can go ahead and just hit enter, and that'll generate a new airline model for us. And then I want to go ahead and do the same thing for our review model. So I'm going to do Rails gModel again, but this time we're going to do review. And for this, I want to give it a title, which is going to be a string. I want to give it a description, which will be a string or maybe a type of text. I'm just going to leave that as a string for now. And then we also want to give it a score. So it'll range from 1 to 5. And then we also want to clarify the relationship. And in this case, reviews are going to belong to airlines. So what we can do is actually do airline, and then we can do colon belongs to. And by doing that, we can basically just establish the belongs to relationship between our reviews and our airline. And what we'll see in a second is this will also handle setting up the foreign key on the table and create an index for us on the airline ID for reviews. So let's go ahead and hit enter and run that. Okay, so now if we jump over into our app, if we go into models, what we'll see now is that we have this new airline model, and we can see we also have a review model. And because we specified that belongs to relationship in our generator, you can see it actually already added belongs to airline here for us within our review model, which is pretty cool. So now if we jump into DB migrate, we can see that we actually created 2 new migrations as well. So Rails uses active record, which tightly couples our models with the structure of our database. So when we ran that generator, we basically created models with attributes, and we simultaneously created 2 migrations to create new tables for our database with those same attributes as fields. So you can see in this example, we created a migration to create a new table for airlines in our database. And you can see that all the attributes we specified from the command line are here as fields. So we have name with a type string, and we have image URL with a type string, and then we have our slug with a type of string. And if we jump into the other file, we can see that we also created a table for reviews. And this also has like all the fields that we created in our generator. So we have our title as a string, we have our description as a string. You can see we specified score as an integer, and then you can actually see that this set up that belongs to relationship. So that takes care of having to add the airline ID as the foreign key for this table, and it'll actually create an index for us as well. So if that all looks good, then what we can do is jump back over into our terminal, and we can just run Rails DB migrate. And what we'll see is that that will create a new schema file for us in a second. And you can see that just added this schema file. And now if we jump over here, we can see we have these 2 new tables created in our database. So we have our airlines table and we have our reviews table. And you can actually take a look and see that it's added the airline ID for us, and that it's added an index as well. So then one more quick thing we just need to do. So because we specified that relationship, we saw that review already has belongs to airline in it, but we don't actually have that set up in our airline model yet. So to handle the has many part of the relationship, we just have to add has many reviews here in our airline model. So inside of our airline model, I want to add a couple additional things here. So I want to add a way that when we create a new airline, we take the name of that airline and we basically slugify it and then set that as the slug value before we then save that new airline to our database. So what we can do is basically create a slugify method. And what I want to do is basically just set this up so that it takes the airline's name and converts it into a URL safe slug and then sets it as the slug value. So what we can basically do is just something like self.slug equals, and then we can take the name of the airline and just call parameterize on it. And what that should do is basically create a URL safe version of the name. So we can jump over here and actually test that out really quick. So if we jump into our Rails console, let's say that we have a name of an airline like United Airlines, and let's say we call parameterize on that. You can see it basically will convert that from this structure where it has, for example, capital letters and spaces, and it'll actually hyphenate the spaces and lowercase everything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this up with a before create callback. So we do before create slugify, and so what that'll do is basically set the slug for our airline before we create it in our database. And then I want to add one other method here, which is I want to add a method that we can use to get the average score of the reviews for an airline. So let's say for an airline we have 2 reviews, for example, and one has a score of 1 and one has a score of 5. It'd be nice if we have a simple method that lets us quickly get the average of those scores. So what we can do is just do reviews to get all the reviews for an airline, and we can do dot average, and specifically we want to get the average of score. And then what I'm going to do is round that to, let's say, 2 places for now, and then we can just convert that to a float. So now that we have that set up, let's go ahead and create some seed data for our app. So if we jump back into this DB folder, if we jump into seeds, we can get rid of the example they gave us, and I'm just going to paste in some seed data. And so if we take a look at this, we can see that I'm basically creating 6 new airlines, and then I'm creating 2 new reviews for our first airline, which is going to be United Airlines. So for each airline, we're basically just adding a name and an image URL. And if we look down here for the reviews, you can see for each review, I'm just adding a title, a description, a score, and then the airline that the review is going to belong to. And in this case, they're both going to belong to the first airline that we're creating, which should be United Airlines. So let's go ahead and run that. So I'm going to get out of the console. And we just run Rails DB seed now. And if you don't see any output from that, then the implication is that it probably worked. So let's jump into our console again, and let's just look and see if we have some data. Cool, so you can see we have our first airline, and that's United Airlines. If we count, we can see we created 6 new airlines, and if we look at review, we can see we also have 2 reviews. So let's just make sure that everything's working so far. So I'm going to say, I'm going to grab our first airline, which is United Airlines. And if you look, you can see, even though we only provided our seed data with the name and the image URL, if we do airline.slug, you can see because we added that slugify callback method before we created this airline, it actually created a slug for that as well. But let's go ahead and check. So we should, for this airline, have 2 reviews. We can see it looks like that's all working. And then I also just want to check that our average score method actually works. So let's say airline.average score. And we can see that the average score is 3, which is correct because the first review had a score of 5 and the second review had a score of 1. So the average should be 3. So it looks like everything is working so far, which is good. So that basically handles everything that we need to do to set up our models for now. So the next thing that I'm going to focus on is building out our API. And I'm going to use a gem for this. Use a gem called Fast JSON API. And this is a gem that was put together by the team at Netflix. But if you've ever used Active Model Serializer, then you'll probably notice some similarities. So I'm going to go ahead and install this gem into our project. So back over in my editor, I'm going to jump into our gem file, and I'm just going to throw this in here. We can go ahead and just exit our console here, and we can do bundle install to add that gem to our project. So once we have that gem installed, we can actually use a generator to create a new airline serializer and a review serializer. And then we can actually pass along the specific attributes that we want to expose in our API. So for example, we can do Rails G serializer now. And what I want to do is create a new airline serializer. And for that, I want the attributes that we're going to expose in our API to basically be our airline's name, the image URL, and the slug. So we can hit enter on that. And that'll actually spin up a new serializer for us. So what that's going to do is create a new serializers folder inside of our app folder. And then you can see that created an airline serializer in this case. And then we also want to create one for reviews as well. So what we can do is basically, again, do Rails G serializer. And then we're going to do review this time. And for that, I want to add the title, the description, the score, and I also want to let's add the airline ID for now. And then we'll hit enter for that. And so now if we jump back over into our code, if we look inside of app, you can see that basically created a new serializers folder. And inside of that, we now have an airline serializer and a review serializer. And if you take a look inside of the serializers that just got spun up for us, you can see all the attributes that we just defined with that generator are all defined as attributes here. So in review, we have title, description, score, and airline ID. And then in airline, you can see that we have the name, image URL, and slug. And so for our airline serializer, I want to actually just add the has many relationship with reviews. So we can do that similar to what we did in our model. And that's basically all we really need to do for now for our serializers. So we can actually jump over into our Rails console. And we can take a look at a quick example of how we're going to use these. So let's say we have our first airline. What we can do is we can actually grab our airline serializer, for example. We can create a new instance of that, and then we can pass in our airline to that. And then what we can do is basically call, for example, serialized JSON, and we can take a look at the format that that's going to convert that into. So what we can do is actually take a look at that just as JSON. So if we call as JSON on that, and you can take a look at the structure of the data, but basically if you look in this attributes section inside of our JSON, you can see that all of the attributes for that record that we specified that we want to be exposed in our API are provided here. So we have the name, we have the image URL, and we have the slug. So we can actually, just as an example, if we only included the name in our attributes here, and if we tried that again, we can say airline equals airline.first, and then we say airline serializer dot new and pass in our airline, and then call as JSON on that. If we look back at the attributes, you can see that now it's just the name value specified in our attributes. So we can kind of control what we want to expose here by providing that to our attributes in our serializer. So that's basically everything that we need to do for now for the serializers. So with that set up, we can probably jump over into our controllers now. So for this app, I'm going to have 3 controllers. So we're going to have an airlines controller, we're going to have a reviews controller, and then I'm also going to create a pages controller that's going to have basically like a single index method. And what I'm going to do is basically make pages index the root path of our app, but then I'm also going to set it up as a sort of catch-all for any requests outside of our API. And that's going to come in handy once we start using React Router in a little bit on the front end. So for our airlines and reviews controllers, I'm going to namespace everything under API v1. And this is also just going to help simplify things for how we manage routing from both the Rails side of our app with our API, and then also the React side of our app once we start working with React Router in a little bit. So let's actually jump over into our routes. So we jump down into config and then routes. Let's actually set up the routes for our app. So I'm going to get rid of this, and then we can just set everything up. So basically, the first thing I want to do is set up the root path. So I'm going to set root to pages index, and then I want to just go ahead and namespace our API. So I'm going to do namespace API, and we'll create a block. And inside of that, we're also going to namespace everything that we do to v1. So we'll create another block for that. And then basically inside of that, we can actually create our resources for airlines and reviews. So we can do resources airlines. And for this, I actually want to specify the param that we're going to set for this. I'm going to make it slug. So we can actually use that slug value that we created instead of using the ID as the primary param for airlines in our routing. And then I also want to create resources for reviews. And for this, we're just going to scope this down for now to only be create and destroy. And then the last thing that I want to do here is I'm going to actually get, we're going to do star path, and then we're going to route that to our root path. So we're going to route that to pages index. We're going to do via all. And what that'll do is this will basically route requests that aren't for existing paths predefined in our API back to our index path. And so the reason that I'm doing that, again, is that once we start using React Router, this will allow us to basically handle routing to our React components without interfering with our actual Rails routes for our API. So I don't know if this is the best way to do this, but it's an approach that I've been using that seems to work decently well. And you know what, we need to fix, this should be only as a key there. But now with that set up, we can actually go ahead and let's exit the Rails console here. And what we can do is we can go ahead and create our controllers. So we can use another generator if we want to create our controllers, or we could probably just jump over into our controllers folder and actually create them ourselves if we want. And let's create a new pages controller. And inside of that, let's just create a new class called pages controller. It's going to inherit from application controller. And all that this is going to have is an index method, which again is just going to be the root path for our application. So then what we can do now is inside of our controllers folder, I'm going to create a new folder called API, and then I'm going to create a new folder inside of that called v1. And then inside of that, let's create a new file, and we'll call this our airlines controller. And then we also want to create a reviews controller. And then for each of these, we basically just want to namespace these inside of a module. It's going to correspond with the namespaces that we created in our routes. So it'll be module API and then module v1. And then inside of that, we'll create our new class. So for this, it'll be airlines controller. And that'll inherit from application controller. And then we'll basically just do the same thing for our reviews controller. So let's change that to be reviews. And then let's start by building out our airlines controller. So inside of our airlines controller, the first thing I want to do is create an index method. So all we need to do for this method is get all of the airlines from our database and then render that data using our airline serializer. So what we can do is basically just do airlines equal airline.all. And then we can just pass that value into our airline serializer like we did before. So we can do airline serializer.new and pass in airlines. And then what we want to do is convert that to serialized JSON. And then all we have to do is render that as JSON from within our controller method. And then we can also create a show method that's basically going to be the exact same thing except with an individual airline. And in this case, we're actually going to find the airline based off of the slug parameter that we specified as the param in our routes. So what we can do is say airline equals airline.findBy. We want to find by slug. And in this case, it's going to be params slug. And then we can basically just copy exactly what we did here, except we want to make sure that we're just passing in the individual airline in this case. So next we can go ahead and add a create method. And so for the create method, we probably want to do something like add strong parameters. So what we can do is create a private method and call it airline params, and then we can set up basically a whitelist of the parameters that we want to actually allow here. So in this case, I'm going to do params.require airline, and then I'm going to do .permit. And what we can do here is add in all the parameters that we want to allow. And in this case, it's basically just going to be, I think, name and image URL for now. But then what we can do is inside of our create method now, we can actually say basically airline equals airline.new and pass in our airline params to that. And then basically all we have to do is say, if airline.save, so if we're able to save the record and everything's valid, then we want to render JSON, and we basically just want to do what we did up here. So we want to render JSON with our airline serializer and pass in our airline and then render that as serialized JSON. Otherwise, if for some reason it's not valid and we can't save the record, then we want to just render out some sort of error message. So we can say like error, we can say airline.errors.messages. We can go ahead and also specify the status if we want. So then our update method will be basically identical to that. So what we can do is just copy that over and create an update method. And the only two differences here are basically going to be that instead of creating a new instance of the airline, we basically want to do find by like we did in our show method. So we're going to find the existing airline by its slug. And then what we can do is instead of save, we can say if airline.update and pass in our airline params. And basically just say if that's able to update successfully, then we'll render back the airline using our airline serializer. Otherwise, we'll render back an error. And then finally, we also want to create, let's say, a destroy method. So for our destroy method, we're basically going to do the exact same thing almost as our update method. So we're going to find the record by its param, and then basically we are just going to say if, instead of update, we're going to say if airline.destroy, then we want to just render maybe head no content. Otherwise, if there's an error, then we'll return the error with the status of 422, which is unprocessable entity. And that's basically all that we need to do to set up our airline controller. So there's one other thing that I want to do though before we switch over to our reviews controller. So when we render the data on our airlines using our airline serializer, I want to make sure that we're also including any associated review data for that airline in the JSON payload. So one way that we can do this with FastJSON API is by structuring our response as something that's called a compound document. But basically all that we need to do for this is when we initialize a new instance of our airline serializer, we can basically pass in an optional options hash and specify the additional resources that we want to include with that. So what we can do is we could create, for example, like another private method and just call this options. And then inside of this, we can create an instance variable and basically just set that equal to a hash. And what we need to do is specify the resources that we want to include. And in this case, all it's going to be, so it would be like an array of resources, but all it's going to be for now is just reviews. But then what we can do is basically just take this method, and when we initialize our serializers up above, we can just include this after airlines as a second argument for our serializer. So we want to add that into our index method, and then we'd also want to add that into our show method. We don't need to do that for create because we won't actually have any reviews yet at that point because we're just creating the airline for the first time. And we don't need to do that for destroy, but we probably also want to do that for update. So let's add that. And with that, I think we're good for now for our airlines controller. So let's actually jump over into our reviews controller. And this should basically be simpler than our airlines controller because all I'm going to create for now for this is a create method and a destroy method. So what we can do in here is for our create method, we probably want to use strong parameters again. So I'm going to create a private method and just call this review params. And inside of this, again, I'm going to do params dot require review, and then we'll permit the attributes that we want to allow in here. So in this case, it's going to be title, it's going to be description. We want to allow a score, and we want to allow probably the airline ID. And then with that, what we can do is go ahead and create our create method. So for our create method, we want to say review equals review.new and pass in our review params. And then we basically want to just do the same thing that we did in our airlines controller. So basically if review.save, so basically if everything's valid and we can save our new review, then we want to render JSON. And we can use our review serializer. So we'll create a new instance of that, we'll pass in our review, and then we want to convert that to serialized JSON. Otherwise, if for some reason we can't save the review, then we want to render JSON and just return an error with the reason that that's not valid. So we'll do review.errors.messages, and we'll set the status of that to be an unprocessable entity. And then for our destroy method, we can basically just copy that over and we'll rename that to destroy. But what we want to do here is basically find an existing review by the ID. So in this case, we'll be using ID. And basically instead of save, we just want to say if review.destroy, so if we're able to destroy the review, then we want to render probably no content again. Otherwise, if for some reason that goes wrong, we'll just render an error message with the errors for that review. So now that we have our models, controllers, serializers, and routes all set up, let's actually go ahead and test out our API. So we can do that using a REST client tool like Insomnia or Postman. I'm going to use Insomnia, but what you use doesn't really matter here. And it also might be helpful just to look at our routes that we've created so far. You can do that from your terminal by just doing Rails routes. And that should basically show us a list of all of the routes that we've created for this app. So if we scroll back up here, we can see basically all the routes that we've set up. So we have our route path here, which is just /. We have our API v1 airlines index method, which is just API/v1/airlines, et cetera, et cetera. So let's go ahead and actually test this out. So I'm going to fire up our server doing Rails S. And then over in Insomnia, I'm just going to create a new request. And we'll just call this airlines index. Basically what I want to do is just create a GET request that's going to go to localhost 3000 /API/v1/airlines. We can do airlines.json just to be safe. But basically what we should hope to see is that when we send this GET request, this is going to hit our, this should hit our airlines index method. So basically what we'll do is get all the airlines from our database, and then we should see that rendered as JSON using the format from our airline serializer. So let's see what happens when we submit that request. Cool, so you can see we send that request to our API, and what we've got back over here as a response is a JSON object, and this is just using the format for JSON API that we'll get by using those serializers. So you can see the top level key is data, and then inside of that we have an array of all of our airlines from our database. So you can see the first one has an ID of 1, and this is United Airlines. And if you look at the attributes, you can see basically all the attributes that we specified for that. And then you can also see we have this relationships object because we specify that this airline has many reviews. And then because we structured this as a compound document, if we look down at the bottom, you can see that there's an included key that has an array of all the reviews that exist for airlines in this case, because we're returning multiple airlines, and the ID of the associated airline that it belongs to. So that all looks good. So let's try to hit our airline show endpoint next. And for that, we actually need to grab the slug from one of our airlines. So I'm going to grab this United Airlines slug, and I'm going to create a new request for airline show. And for this, we basically just want to send a request to localhost 3000/API/v1/airlines. And then we want to add that slug to the URL. So back in our airlines controller, when we hit our show method, we should be able to find that airline in our database by the slug param. And then again, we'll just render that JSON back using our airline serializer. So let's jump over here and see what happens when we submit that. Nice. So it looks like that worked. Again, we have this format. This time, instead of an array of airlines, we have just the specific airline that we're getting the data for. And then we can see because this specific airline has those 2 reviews, so both of those belong to United Airlines, you can see that we have those values in that included section in our API response. So that all looks good. So next, let's actually try to create a new airline. So let's create another request, and I'm going to make this airlines create. And in this case, what we want to do is we want our request to be for localhost 3000/API v1 airlines. But this time it's actually going to be a post request that we're going to make. And in this case, we actually want to include a body for our post request. So what I'm going to do is add a name here, and I'm just going to give this fake name. So let's do fake airline. But what we would expect to happen is that we're going to hit our create method, and this will create a new airline for us and then save it and render back JSON. So let's see what happens when we try to do that. So let's submit this request. We can see in that case we actually got an error back. So we can see that the status is 422. And if we look here, we can see that we actually got an invalid authenticity token error back from our controller. So the issue here is basically that we're trying to make a post request to our controller without a valid CSRF token, and Rails has built-in protection against that by default. So what we can do to fix that for now is if we jump back into our controller, what we can do is just say protect from forgery with, and we'll set this to null session, and that'll basically fix that issue for us. And we also want to do this in our reviews controller as well. So let's add that, and then let's jump back over into our request tool here, and let's try to create that airline again. So if we submit that post request again, we can see that resolved the issue, and now we're actually able to create that new airline. So we've actually added a new airline to our database with the name of fake airline, and we can see that that actually created a slug for us as well. And then we can see that it has a new ID. So initially we had 6 airlines, and we just added a 7th. So what we can actually do if we want is we can go back to our show request, and if we check now for fake airline, we should be able to get that back. So all that looks good. So let's test out our update endpoint. So we'll do airlines update. And basically for this, we can make a patch request, and let's actually make a patch request to that new airline that we just created. And what we want to do is let's change the name of that as a test. So I'm going to add some JSON here, and let's just say name equals and we can just set that equal to like other fake airline as the name. And let's try to submit that. So we can see that that worked, and that updated the name of that airline in our database to now be other fake airline. And so finally, let's actually test out as well our destroy method. So let's create a new request, and I'm just going to call this airlines destroy, and we will, again, we'll take that new fake airline that we just created, and let's just create a delete request, and let's see what happens when we send that. So we got 204 no content back, and it looks like that all worked. So now if we, for example, go back to our show method and try to get that specific airline, we won't actually get anything back because it no longer exists in our database. So that all looks good. So let's actually also test out our review endpoints. So let's see reviews create, for example. Let's just copy over like a URL from this, and we'll pass that in there, but we'll go to API v1 reviews. We want this to be a post request, and we'll set up a body, use some JSON, and we'll give this a title. We'll say, we'll make this a positive review, so we'll say great experience. We'll give this a description as well, and that'll be, something for that. And then we also want to give this a score. So we'll say, we'll give that a 4 as a score, and then we want to tie this back to the specific airline that this review is going to belong to. So for the airline ID, let's just make this 1. So it'll be for, I believe it's United Airlines. But then let's submit this and see what happens. Oh, you know what? It looks like there's a typo in my reviews controller. So if we look at create, it looks like I just mixed that up. So let's try that again. Cool. Okay, so it looks like that created the review for that airline. We can see that that created a new review in our database. But now if we go back and we get, I think in this case it's going to be United Airlines, we should see, if we go down to included, we can see, yes, so now we have that new review is included for that airline. And then additionally, let's just make sure that we test out reviews destroy. And in this case, we are going to basically send a delete request to, I think in this case, it's the third review. So let's just make this a delete request, API v1 reviews 3. Let's send that. That also broke because I have the typo in destroy as well. Let's fix that. So we send that. That works. We get back to a 4 no content, which is what we want. And now if we go back to our United Airlines request, if we send that again, we can see we are only getting back those first 2 reviews now because we deleted the third one. So it looks like all of the endpoints for our API are working.